Chapter 1. The Whispering Steppe, a World of Endless Horizons. In the heart of Asia, where the earth breathes beneath an endless canopy of sky, there is a land that stretches beyond sight, a world of vast golden grasslands rising and falling like the waves of a silent, ancient sea. This is the Mongolian steppe, a place where the wind speaks in whispers, carrying the stories of countless generations who wandered these endless horizons. The sky here is not just a ceiling of blue, it is a living spirit, the eternal blue sky, Tengri. To the nomads who call this place home, it is not merely a backdrop, it is a divine presence. Its vastness is a reminder of eternity, its ever-shifting clouds a testament to the transient nature of life. Beneath this sacred sky, the world feels both infinite and fragile, a place where time is measured not by clocks but by the slow dance of the seasons. The grass bends and rises in a gentle, rhythmic sway, brushed by winds that travel from the distant mountains, whispering secrets to the earth. In the distance, wild horses gallop in graceful harmony, their manes dancing like ripples in the golden sea. It is a land of stillness and movement, silence and song, a place where the soul can feel both lost and found beneath the gaze of the eternal blue sky. But this tranquil beauty hides a fierce truth. For those who live beneath Tengri's watchful eye, life is a constant dance between survival and surrender, strength and serenity. It is a world where the spirit of the sky meets the spirit of the earth, where every gust of wind is a reminder of nature's power, and every sunset is a promise of another day under the sacred blue. Nomadic souls, the children of the grasslands. Here, in this world of endless horizons, life is woven from the threads of freedom and hardship. The nomads of Mongolia are the children of the grasslands, their lives shaped by the rhythm of nature, their spirits bound to the will of the eternal blue sky. Their homes are not castles of stone, but round, felted yurts, warm and sturdy, yet as temporary as the seasons they follow. These nomads live not for riches, but for survival. They follow their herds, sheep, goats, horses, and yaks across the plains, guided by the sun, the stars, and the whisper of the wind. Their lives are simple but profound. The crackle of a campfire, the soft murmur of a mother singing to her child, the lowing of cattle as they graze. These are the sounds of a life in harmony with the land. The children learn to ride before they learn to walk, their small hands clutching the thick manes of wild ponies. The elders tell stories of ancestors who roamed these same plains, whose spirits now dance in the stars above. But this freedom comes at a price. Storms sweep across the steppe without warning, and winters are a merciless trial where snow buries the earth and the cold bites deeper than any blade. Yet the nomads endure. They are a people of resilience, their strength not born from iron or gold, but from their bond with the land, the sky, and the whispered wisdom of their ancestors. The warriors of the steppe, a life of struggle and survival, yet beneath this serene image lies a world of struggle, a land where survival is a battle fought with skill, courage, and loyalty. The Mongol steppe is a place of warriors, men and women who are not just herders but fighters, shaped by a life of constant hardship. The steppe is divided among clans. Borjigin, Taichiud, Merkit, Naiman, each with its own bloodline, its own pride, and its own ancient grudges. These clans are bound together by the winds of the grasslands, but divided by honor, revenge, and the fierce desire for survival. Honor is everything here, a sacred thread that binds family, tribe, and destiny. A slight insult can spark a blood feud that lasts for generations. Alliances are made and broken with the turn of a season, and a friend can become an enemy in the blink of an eye. The warriors of the steppe are masters of the horse and the bow. From a young age they learn to ride, to fight, and to hunt. Their horses are not just beasts of burden, but sacred companions, their speed and strength a gift from the eternal blue sky. A Mongol warrior is never truly alone. His horse is his shadow, his bow, his voice, and the wind his guide. But for all their skill and courage, life is a constant struggle. Raids and battles are as common as the rising sun. Clans fight for land, for herds, for honor. A family's fortune can be won or lost in a single battle, and a man's name can become legend or be forgotten with a single stroke of a sword. A child, named Temujin, born in the shadow of Bloodamid, this world of fierce beauty and constant struggle. A child is born beneath the watchful gaze of the eternal blue sky. His name is Temujin, a name that will one day echo across the world, but for now, he is only a child. He is born to the Borjigin clan, a proud but struggling tribe. His father, Yasuge, is a respected chieftain, a man of strength and cunning. But even as Temujin draws his first breath, his life is marked by shadows. His father's enemies circle like wolves, and the peace of the steppe is always a fragile illusion. Temujin's earliest memories are not of warmth or laughter, but of fear and loss. His father is poisoned by enemies, and his family is cast out, left to survive alone on the bitter plains. Hunger is his first teacher, and cold his first enemy. Yet even in suffering there is a spark, a fierce, unyielding spirit that refuses to be crushed. As he grows, Temujin learns the cruel lessons of the steppe. Trust is a rare gift, and betrayal a constant threat. He learns to hunt with a bow, to track with the patience of a wolf, and to fight with the fury of a cornered beast. But most importantly, he learns that survival is not just a matter of strength, but of will. For beneath the sky that stretches forever, beneath the vast whispering steppe, a child is born. A child destined to become a conqueror, a child whose name will one day shake the world. Chapter 2. A Childhood of Betrayal. The Trials of Young Temujin. Beneath the vast, silent sky of the Mongolian steppe, where the winds whispered of forgotten legends, a shadow fell over the life of young Temujin. His father, Yasuge, a proud and respected chieftain of the Borjigin clan, was not a man easily swayed by fear. But even the strongest can fall when treachery is served in a cup. Yasuge had journeyed far, through the windswept plains and beneath the endless blue sky, to secure a bride for his son. It was a journey meant to secure alliances, to strengthen bonds between clans. Yet, on his return, beneath the pretense of friendship, there lurked a hidden danger. Yesuge was welcomed as a guest by the Tatars, old rivals whose smiles concealed a deadly intent. The poison was a quiet killer. It flowed like a whisper, stealing life with every heartbeat. Yasuge returned to his family, but his strength was fading, his skin pale, his breath labored. In the cold light of dawn, with the wind stirring the grass outside, his life slipped away, leaving his family not only grief-stricken, but suddenly vulnerable. For Temujin, it was more than the loss of a father. It was the collapse of a world. The Borjigin clan, now leaderless, turned against his family. The bond of kinship shattered like thin ice beneath the weight of fear and ambition. His mother, Hoilun, once the proud wife of a chieftain, was cast out with her children, abandoned on the barren steppe. Temujin's young heart burned with sorrow, but beneath the grief a flicker of something else stirred. A question, a hunger, not just to survive, but to one day make those who betrayed his family pay. The winter of hunger, a family's struggle. The steppe was a sea of frozen silence, the grasslands buried beneath a blanket of snow. Beneath, the relentless blue sky where the wind whispered but offered no warmth, Temujin, his mother Hoelun, and his siblings wandered, cast out, alone. Hunger was not a distant threat, but a constant companion. The cold gnawed at their bones, the wind pierced their thin clothing, and the earth seemed barren and unyielding. Day by day, Hoelun led her children, her spirit unbroken, even when the world seemed to conspire against them. Her hands, once graced, with fine beads and silks, now clawed at the frozen earth, seeking roots and wild herbs, anything that could stave off the hunger. Fish from the icy rivers became their lifeline. Hoelun taught her children how to break the ice, how to cast their crude nets, their young fingers numb from the cold, but driven by a desperate will to survive. Temujin watched his mother, her fierce determination afire in the midst of the bitter cold. He learned that survival was not just a matter of strength, but of cunning, of resilience, and of an unyielding spirit. He learned that even in the cruelest winter there could be warmth in the courage of those who refused to surrender, but the steppe was merciless. The wind howled, the snow fell, and the cold seemed endless. Nights were a struggle against frost, and days a search for food that seemed always just out of reach. Yet, for every bitter breath, for every empty belly, Temujin's spirit grew sharper, like a blade tempered by suffering. Brothers in blood, bonds of trust and treachery, but the cruelest lesson of all was not taught by the wind or the cold. It came from within his own family. Temujin's struggle was not only with the merciless elements, but with betrayal among his own blood. His half-brother Bekta, once a companion, became a threat. As food grew scarce, so did loyalty. Bekta, driven by hunger, by the primal fear of death, began to take more than his share. He sought to assert himself over Temujin, to command the family in their father's absence. But Temujin was not one to bend. His spirit, though young, was fierce, his heart already hardened by suffering. A struggle brewed beneath the eternal blue sky, a struggle between brothers. Words turned to shouts, shouts to blows, and finally the calm, icy silence of the steppe was shattered by a final, terrible choice. With a bow in his trembling hands, Temujin stood, his eyes locked on Bekta. To some it was an act of cold cruelty, brother turning against brother. But for Temujin it was survival. It was the law of the steppe, a place where weakness meant death, and betrayal was a knife to the throat. When the wind carried away the last echoes of Bekta's cries, Temujin stood alone, a boy who had learned that trust was a fragile thing, a boy who understood that even those who share your blood can become your enemies. The seed of vengeance, a heart hardened by suffering yet, even as the cold wind howled and the sky remained. A distant, uncaring blue, something else began to grow within Temujin, a fierce, unyielding fire. It was not enough to survive. Survival was a struggle, a battle, fought one breath at a time. But Temujin's heart ached for something greater. The faces of those who betrayed his father haunted his dreams. The memory of his family's suffering burned like a brand upon his soul. But this suffering did not break him. It forged him. Each empty night, each cruel day became a lesson. He learned to endure pain without a word, to hide his hunger behind a calm gaze, to measure every word, every look. The steppe was his teacher, a silent, brutal master. It taught him that strength came not just from muscle, but from the mind, from patience, from the ability to wait for the right moment. Beneath the sky that stretched forever, Temujin's dreams were not of escape, but of conquest. He dreamed of uniting the tribes that had cast his family out. He dreamed of a day when he would stand above them, when those who had abandoned them would kneel before him. But even as these dreams burned within him, his face remained calm, his voice soft, his spirit hidden beneath the quiet resolve of a boy who refused to be broken. And so, beneath the vast whispering steppe, beneath the gaze of the eternal blue sky, a child grew, a child whose suffering would one day give birth to a legend. Chapter 3. The Path of the Warrior. Allies and Enemies. Under the vast silent heavens of the Mongolian steppe, where the winds whispered ancient secrets, two young warriors stood side by side. Temujin and Jamuka, two names that were still unknown to the world, but whose fates were bound like the twisting rivers that carved through the endless plains. They were not brothers by birth, but by choice. Beneath the watchful gaze of the eternal blue sky, they stood, their young faces stern, but their hearts filled with a quiet, fierce joy. A bond was forged, not in the halls of kings, but in the wild, open expanse of the steppe. They were Anders, blood brothers, a sacred bond sealed by the mingling of their blood, a promise that they would stand by each other in life and in death. "You are my brother," whispered Jamuka, his voice steady, his dark eyes reflecting the distant mountains. "And you are mine," Temujin replied, his voice calm, but his spirit alight with hope. Together, they shared dreams of greatness, of uniting the scattered tribes of the steppe, of bringing order to a world ruled by chaos and bloodshed. They were young, but already their hearts burned with ambition. For a time, they were inseparable. Side by side they rode across the vast plains, the wind in their hair, the earth beneath the hooves of their horses. Together they hunted, they feasted, They laughed beneath the endless sky. The stars seemed closer in those nights, and the firelight danced in their eyes as they spoke of a future where their names would be remembered for eternity. Jamuka was a warrior of tradition, a believer in the old ways, the sacred ties of loyalty and honor. To him, greatness was not just power, but the bond between brothers, the respect of the elders, the ancient customs that had shaped the tribes for generations. But Temujin was different. Beneath his calm gaze there burned a fierce, restless spirit. He respected the traditions, but he also saw their chains. He dreamed not of a world bound by old laws, but of a new order, a world united where strength was not measured by birth, but by courage, loyalty, and the will to conquer. And so beneath the same sky that witnessed their oath, beneath the vast horizon where they once rode as brothers, the seeds of both greatness and tragedy were sown. The price of ambition, a friendship torn apart, but dreams have a cost. Beneath the endless blue sky that once seemed to smile upon them, shadows began to grow. For all their shared laughter, for all their whispered dreams of unity, a quiet tension began to stir between the two brothers. Jamuka was a man of the old ways, and to him loyalty was a sacred bond, not to a single leader, but to the ancient customs of the tribes. He believed in the noble families, the sacred rights of the old Khans, and the strength of the aristocracy. But Temujin was a child of suffering. He had seen how the proud could betray the weak, how noble blood meant nothing, when hunger clawed at your belly or when betrayal lurked in the shadows. To him, strength was not a gift of birth, but a fire that burned within, a fire that could not be quenched by ancient laws or titles. The tension grew, a silent shadow that stretched between them, and then, like a storm breaking over the steppe, the bond of brotherhood shattered. Jamuka chose the path of the noble clans, a path of tradition, of loyalty to the ancient ways. But Temujin chose a different path, a path of strength, of loyalty, not to birthright, but to courage, to those who would follow him, not because of his name, but because of his vision. Their dreams, once intertwined, now stood in opposition. A promise that had once been whispered beneath the sacred sky became a distant memory. And where there had been brotherhood, there now stood rivalry. Jamuka saw Temujin as a threat, a boy who would dare challenge the sacred order of the steppe. And Temujin saw Jamuka as a chain, a man who clung to a world of empty titles and ancient grudges. The steppe, vast and silent, became a battlefield of ambition. The wind that once carried their laughter now whispered of betrayal, and the stars that had watched over their youth seemed cold and distant. The Battle of the 13 Wings, a test of strength, and then beneath the shadow of the mountains, the silence of the steppe was shattered by the thunder of hooves, the clash of swords, and the screams of men. The bond of brotherhood was not just broken, it was drowned in blood. The Battle of the 13 Wings, a war between two friends turned rivals. Temujin with his followers, men who believed not in noble blood, but in strength, in loyalty, in the promise of a new order. And Jamuka with his warriors, proud, fierce, loyal to the ancient ways, to the sacred bloodlines of the steppe. The sky above, seemed endless, silent, watching without pity as brothers became enemies. Dust rose in great clouds as warriors charged, arrows darkened the heavens, and the earth trembled beneath the fury of battle. Temujin led his men with a calm, fierce resolve. His voice was steady, his gaze sharp, his spirit unbroken, even as the chaos of battle raged around him. He fought not just with strength, but with cunning, with the patience of a wolf, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Jamuka was no less fierce. His warriors fought with the pride of ancient bloodlines, with the strength of tradition. Beneath his banner they stood like a wall of steel, unyielding, their spirits bound by loyalty to the old ways. The battle was a storm, fierce, terrible, and in its wake the steppe was littered with the fallen. The sky, so vast and eternal, seemed to weep with a soft, silent wind. But there were no victors, only survivors. For though Temujin's forces were battered, his spirit remained unbroken. And though Jamuka's pride was fierce, he saw the strength of the boy he had once called brother, a strength that could not be crushed. The rise of a leader. The birth of Genghis Khan. The silence that followed the storm amid the ashes. Of brotherhood and the blood of the fallen, a new name began to echo across the steppe. Temujin, a name that was now whispered with both fear and awe. He had lost battles, but he had gained something greater. The loyalty of men who saw in him not just a warrior, but a leader. A leader who did not demand loyalty through bloodlines, but through courage, through vision, through the promise of a new world. And so the scattered tribes, the wandering clans, the warriors who had once fought against him, now began to rally to his side. Beneath the eternal blue sky, in the shadow of the mountains, Temujin was given a new name, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. He was no longer just a boy who had once wandered the frozen steppe, no longer just a child who had learned the harsh lessons of suffering. He was a force that would one day shake the world. But even as his name grew, even as his banner rose above the steppe, a shadow remained. The memory of a brother, once beloved, now lost. The memory of a bond broken by the weight of dreams. And beneath the endless sky, the wind whispered of both greatness and grief. For the boy who had become a conqueror, and for the brother who had become an enemy. Chapter 4. The Fire of Unity. The Conquest of the Tribes. Beneath the vast, endless blue sky of the Mongolian steppe, a great wind swept across the golden plains, carrying whispers of change. The eternal blue sky seemed to watch in silent majesty as riders raced across the open land, their banners fluttering like wings of eagles. They carried a call that echoed from one clan to another, from one campfire to the next. Genghis Khan, once the boy named Temujin, had summoned them, all the chieftains, all the warriors, all the wandering tribes of the steppe. It was a call to a Kuriltai, a grand council, a gathering where the destiny of a people would be decided. In the heart of the steppe, where the winds whispered and the grass danced in gentle waves, they came. The Borjigin, the Taichiud, the Ongirat, and the countless clans that had once been scattered, each with its own pride, its own grudges. Warriors with fierce faces and weary eyes, chieftains with their proud banners, elders who had seen 100 winters, they gathered beneath the eternal blue sky, a sea of humanity under the vast heavens. Genghis Khan stood before them, not as a chieftain of one clan, but as a man who had risen from suffering, a man who had forged his strength in the fires of betrayal and hardship. His voice was calm but strong, carried by the wind, heard by all who stood beneath the sky's endless gaze. "I have called you here," he began, his eyes sweeping across the gathered tribes, "because the time has come for us to end the years of division, the years of bloodshed. The steppe is vast, but we are one people, born beneath the same sky, children of the same earth." There was silence, a silence that seemed to stretch beneath the heavens. Some listened with hope, others with doubt, and some with quiet, simmering fear. For they knew Genghis Khan's strength, a strength that had grown with each battle, each conquest. But Genghis Khan spoke not of himself, but of unity. He spoke of a world where the tribes would no longer war against one another, where strength would not be wasted in endless feuds, but forged together in a single, unstoppable force. He spoke of a nation, not of clans, but of a united people, a people who would ride beneath one banner, one name. The eternal blue sky watched as murmurs spread through the crowd. Some were moved, some were afraid, but one by one the chieftains stepped forward, their hands raised in a gesture of allegiance. A new order was rising, a fire that would not be quenched. The fall of the Merkits, vengeance fulfilled, but words alone could not bind the tribes, and unity demanded a price. Beneath the vast sky, where the wind carried the scent of wild grass and the cry of eagles, Genghis Khan turned his gaze toward the north, toward the land of the Merkits. The Merkits, a tribe that had once wronged him, a tribe that had stolen his bride, Berta, in his youth. Their name was a scar upon his heart, a reminder of a time when he was powerless, when his family had been torn apart. But now he was no longer that boy. He was Genghis Khan, and his name was a name that carried fear. The warriors rode beneath his banner. Men who had once been scattered, now united in a single, unstoppable force. Their horses thundered across the steppe. Their bows sang with deadly precision. Their swords flashed beneath the light of the eternal blue sky. The Merkits, proud and fierce, stood in defiance, but they were not facing a single clan. They were facing a storm, a tide that swept across their lands with a fury that could not be stopped. Genghis Khan's warriors struck like the wind, swift and relentless. Tents burned, warriors fell, and the proud cries of the Merkit chieftains were drowned beneath the roar of battle. Berta was freed, her captors scattered, and the Merkits, a tribe that had once brought suffering upon Temujin, were no more. Their name became a whisper, their strength a memory, and their lands a silent sea of ash beneath the eternal sky. Genghis Khan had not only avenged the wrongs of his past, he had sent a message to those who would stand against him, to those who would cling to their grudges and their pride. He was not just a man, he was a force of unity, of vengeance, of destiny. The subjugation of the Naimans. The last stronghold of the steppe was vast, and the dream of unity was a dream of conquest. Beyond the mountains, beneath the distant sky, stood the Naimans, a proud tribe, fierce and mighty, the last great stronghold against Genghis Khan's rising power. Their chieftain, Taiang Khan, was a warrior of renown, his name a symbol of defiance. His warriors were fierce, his stronghold a fortress of strength, and beneath his banner he gathered all those who still resisted, those who saw Genghis Khan as a tyrant, those who clung to the old ways, to the freedom of the tribes. But Genghis Khan did not fear them. He marched upon the Naimans like a storm upon the mountains. His warriors were a tide, disciplined and fierce, their arrows darkening the sky, their swords flashing like lightning. The battle was fierce, a clash of steel, a roar of warriors, the earth trembling beneath the charge of horses. The Naimans fought with the pride of those who would rather die than kneel, their banners fluttering like wounded eagles beneath the eternal blue sky. But Genghis Khan was not just a warrior. He was a leader who fought not for glory, but for unity, for a dream that could not be crushed. His tactics were swift, his will unyielding, and one by one the Naiman warriors fell. Taiang Khan's banner fell, his warriors scattered, and the proud stronghold of the Naimans became a silent ruin. Beneath the gaze of the endless sky, Genghis Khan stood victorious. The last great tribe of the steppe had fallen. The birth of an empire. The Mongol nation, united beneath the eternal blue sky, in the heart of the vast whispering steppe. A new banner rose, the banner of the Mongols, a banner of unity, of strength, of destiny. Genghis Khan stood before his warriors not as a chieftain of one tribe, but as the ruler of all. The tribes that had once been scattered, warring, divided, now stood as one. Men who had once been rivals now fought side by side, bound not by blood, but by loyalty to a single name. The wind whispered across the plains, carrying the scent of wild grass, the distant cry of eagles, and the quiet murmur of a new world rising beneath the sky. Genghis Khan, the boy who had once wandered the frozen steppe, the boy who had suffered and struggled, now stood at the head of an empire born not from noble blood, but from strength, from suffering, from the fierce, unyielding will of a man who had refused to be broken. And as the warriors raised their voices, as the banners danced in the wind, a new name echoed across the steppe, a name that would one day shake the world. Genghis Khan, the master of the steppe, the unifier of the tribes, the conqueror whose shadow stretched beneath the vast eternal sky. Chapter 5. The Law of the Steppe, Genghis Khan's Code. Beneath the endless blue sky of the Mongolian steppe, where the wind whispered like an ancient voice, a new order was born. The land that had once been a place of wandering clans, of scattered tribes and endless blood feuds, now stood united beneath a single banner, the banner of Genghis Khan. But unity without order is chaos, and beneath the eternal blue sky a law was born. They called it the Yasa, a sacred code, a set of laws that would transform a fierce, wild people into a disciplined empire. The Yasa was not written on parchment, nor carved into stone. It was a living law, spoken by the Khan himself, passed down by word of mouth, remembered by the hearts of his warriors. Genghis Khan understood that a tribe bound only by fear would one day fall, but a tribe bound by law would stand forever. The Yasa was more than just rules. It was a promise, a promise of justice, of honor, of discipline. It was a code that declared that loyalty was sacred, that treachery would be met with death, that no man, whether noble or common, could stand above the law. Beneath the gaze of the eternal blue sky, the tribes that had once been rivals now stood as brothers bound by the yasa. Warriors who had once fought against one another now rode side by side, their spirits disciplined by a code that demanded courage, loyalty, and honor. But the yasa was more than just a code of battle. It spoke of respect for family, of the sacred bond between father and son, of the duty to protect one's kin. It demanded honesty, forbade theft, and punished betrayal with a fierce, unwavering hand. Beneath its shadow, even the mightiest chieftain stood equal to the humblest herder. Genghis Khan did not rule with fear alone. He ruled with a promise that his people would be strong, not just in arms, but in spirit. A promise that the land beneath the eternal blue sky would be a land of order, of discipline, of law, justice and order, a harsh but fair rule. But the yasa was not just a collection of words. It was a living force, and beneath the shadow of Genghis Khan's banner, justice was swift, impartial, and unyielding. His rule was not a gentle one, but it was fair. And in a world where the strong so often crushed the weak, his fairness was a beacon of order. Stories of his justice spread across the steppe like whispers carried by the wind. There was the tale of the nobleman who had stolen a horse from a poor herder, a nobleman who thought his status would protect him. But beneath the yasa there was no shield for the proud. Genghis Khan's judgment was swift. The nobleman was punished, his wealth taken, and the herder compensated. In the eyes of the Khan, a crime was a crime, whether committed by a prince or a pauper. Another tale spoke of a warrior who had betrayed his comrades in battle, abandoning them in the face of the enemy. For his treachery, he was brought before the Khan, his head bowed in shame. But there were no pleas for mercy, for beneath the yasa, treachery was a poison that could not be tolerated. The traitor's fate was swift, his life taken as a warning to all who would turn against their brothers. But justice was not just a matter of punishment, it was a matter of protection. Beneath the yasa, travelers were guaranteed safety. Merchants could cross the vast steppe without fear of bandits, for the Khan's law protected them. Theft was punished, but generosity was rewarded. Loyalty was sacred, and betrayal was a death sentence. Genghis Khan was a ruler who understood that power was not just the force of arms, but the force of trust, the trust of a people who knew that their lives, their families, their homes were protected by a law that showed neither favor nor fear. Religious freedom, the Khan's unexpected tolerance. But beneath the fierce discipline of the yasa, there was a freedom that was rare in an age of conquest. For though Genghis Khan was a man of steel, a man who demanded loyalty and discipline, he was also a man who understood the power of belief. Under his rule, a remarkable policy was declared, the policy of religious freedom, in a world where kings and emperors fought wars in the name of their gods. Genghis Khan declared that all men were free to worship as they wished. The eternal blue sky was his sacred spirit, but he did not demand that others bow to it. Beneath his rule, Buddhists chanted in their temples, Muslims knelt in prayer, Christians whispered their sacred psalms, and shamans sang their ancient songs. To the spirits of the land, temples rose beside mosques, and the smoke of sacred fires mingled with the scent of incense. Genghis Khan did not see faith as a threat. He saw it as a source of strength. He understood that a united empire could not be built by crushing the beliefs of its people, but by allowing them to find peace in their own way. And so beneath the vast sky that watched over all, the Mongol Empire became a place of tolerance, a place where faith was a choice, not a command. This was not just a matter of kindness, it was a matter of wisdom. By granting freedom of religion, Genghis Khan won the loyalty of priests, of scholars, of wise men who brought knowledge from distant lands. His empire was not just a land of warriors, but a land of learning, of culture, of faiths that flourished beneath the shadow of his banner. The strength of unity, a people, bound by law beneath the eternal blue sky, where the wind whispered across. The golden grasslands, a great empire rose. It was an empire forged not just by the sword, but by the law, the yasa, a code that bound a fierce, wild people into a disciplined, unstoppable force. Warriors who had once fought for their own, clans now fought for a single name, Genghis Khan. Merchants crossed the steppe without fear, knowing that the Khan's law protected them. Priests prayed without fear, their temples safe beneath his shadow. But the true strength of this empire was not just in its armies, nor in its wealth, it was in its unity, a unity forged by a law that showed neither favor nor fear. Beneath the yasa all men were brothers. Beneath the yasa all were bound by honor, by discipline, by the sacred promise of justice. Genghis Khan had not just conquered the steppe, he had transformed it. A land that had once been a sea of chaos, of blood feuds and wandering clans, now stood as one. An empire that would one day shake the world. And beneath the vast, endless sky, the wind whispered a name that would be remembered for centuries, a name that would echo across the earth. Genghis Khan, the lawgiver, the unifier, the master of the steppe. Chapter 6. Thunder over Asia. The Khwarezmian Campaign. The vast plains stretched endlessly beneath the eternal sky, where the winds whispered secrets of ages long past. Beneath that boundless blue, the Mongol Empire breathed, a colossal force that had grown from scattered nomadic clans into a thunderous storm. But in the year 1218, that storm found a reason to rage, a reason rooted not in conquest but in betrayal. Genghis Khan, the great Khan of the Mongols, was no stranger to diplomacy. Despite his fearsome reputation, he had always valued honor among his allies and respected the agreements made through peaceful words. His empire stretched from the steppes of Mongolia to the edges of civilization, and he knew that trade was the lifeblood of nations. When he sought to establish trade with the Khwarezmian Empire, a prosperous realm ruled by Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, he sent his ambassadors, gifts in hand, a gesture of goodwill beneath the gaze of the eternal sky. But what met them was treachery. The envoys, dressed in the finest silks of the steppes, entered the bustling Khwarezmian city of Otrar. There, the governor, suspecting them of espionage, seized them without cause. Some were executed, others imprisoned. When news of this reached Genghis Khan, his first reaction was not rage, but patience. he sent a second delegation, this time to the Shah himself, pleading for justice for the punishment of the governor who had betrayed diplomatic custom. But Shah Muhammad, proud in his wealth and power, ordered the beheading of the Mongol ambassadors and sent their severed heads back to Genghis Khan. The heavens darkened, the winds that swept across the Mongol plains carried with them the whispers of fury. The great Khan who had offered peace now saw only one path: war. An insult had been
struck, not against just a man, but against an empire.
And to Genghis Khan, the only answer was thunder. The siege of Bukhara. A city's doom beneath the shadow of war, the Mongol horde surged forward, a tempest of horsemen whose hooves drummed like thunder on the earth. In the winter of 1219, Genghis Khan led his armies across the frozen steppes, a force so vast that it seemed to stretch from one horizon to the other. Their target was Bukhara, a jewel of the Khwarezmian Empire, a city whose grand minarets and bustling markets stood as symbols of wealth and power. But to the Mongols it was a city of betrayal. The walls of Bukhara stood tall, their defenders confident behind thick fortifications. But the Mongols were not a mere army, they were a force of nature. Siege engines appeared like storm clouds on the horizon, and within days the city's gates were shattered. The defenders who survived the breach fled to the citadel, desperate to escape the wrath that had descended upon them. It was then that Genghis Khan himself entered the city, riding calmly through its ruined streets. His eyes, cold and unyielding, surveyed the trembling citizens gathered before him. And in a voice like distant thunder he spoke words that would echo through history. "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The citadel fell soon after. The soldiers who had sought refuge within were slaughtered. The wealth of Bukhara was plundered, its people enslaved. The once proud city, with its grand bazaars and golden domes, was reduced to ash and blood. Beneath, the grey skies, the Mongol banners fluttered like vultures over the desolation. Bukhara, once a city of light, had become a shadow in the wake of Mongol vengeance, the destruction of Samarkand, a capital in ashes. As the Mongol horde swept onward, Samarkand, the great capital of the Khwarezmian Empire, stood next in line. Its walls were said to be impregnable, its armies vast and well-armed. But against the might of Genghis Khan, such defences were whispers before the storm. In the spring of 1220, the Mongols surrounded Samarkand. Siege towers loomed like skeletal giants against the horizon, while Mongol archers, with their deadly precision, darkened the skies. The defenders of Samarkand fought fiercely, but courage alone was no match for the relentless assault. Within days, the gates were breached. The defenders, overwhelmed, sought mercy from the conquerors. But mercy was a luxury they would not find. The Mongol banners marched through the burning streets, and chaos consumed the city. Samarkand's grand palaces crumbled beneath the siege, its libraries became pyres, and its people became prisoners. Genghis Khan's generals, disciplined and
ruthless, executed the defenders, their heads piled in pyramids outside the city walls, a brutal message to all who would defy the great Khan. Yet even in the ashes, stories would spread, tales of Genghis Khan, the conqueror who showed no mercy.
And of Samarkand, the city that burned beneath his wrath. Its golden spires and sacred mosques became dust, and its name became a whisper of terror. The ghost of the steppe, the wrath of Genghis Khan in the aftermath of the Khwarezmian campaign, the world trembled. Stories of the Mongol hordes spread. Like wildfire, each tale more terrifying than the last. Some spoke of entire cities erased from the earth, their populations slaughtered. Others whispered of ghostly riders who moved like shadows, appearing and disappearing with the wind. To the people of Persia, Genghis Khan was no longer just a man. He was a spectre, a force beyond mortal understanding. His armies seemed to materialize out of the mist, and no fortress, no city, no kingdom was safe from their wrath. He was the ghost of the steppe, a vengeful storm that swept across Asia, leaving nothing but death in its wake. But beneath the tales of terror, a darker truth remained. Genghis Khan was not just a conqueror, he was a force of retribution. The Khwarezmian Shah, whose arrogance had sparked this inferno, was now a fugitive, his once great empire shattered, his cities in ruins. The world learned a harsh lesson. To betray the great Khan was to invite annihilation. As the dust settled over the ashes of Khwarezm, and the winds of the steppe whispered once more, the name of Genghis Khan echoed like thunder, a name that spoke of vengeance, of judgment, and
of an empire that knew no bounds.
Chapter 7. The Sword of the East. The Conquest of China. Beneath the boundless sky, where the winds danced across the open plains, a whisper stirred in the heart of the great Khan. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, turned toward the east, toward the lands of China, a world of ancient riches, fortified cities, and a history that stretched back to the dawn of civilization. China was a realm of silk and porcelain, of jade palaces and serene gardens, a land where rivers flowed like silver, threads beneath the emerald mountains. To Genghis Khan, the East was more than just a distant land. It was a challenge, a world that promised wealth beyond imagination, but stood defended by towering walls and armies that stretched like fields of iron. It was a realm divided, its rulers locked in their own rivalries, unaware of the storm gathering beyond the mountains. But Genghis Khan was not a mere chieftain of the steppe. He was a force of nature, a man who had carved an empire from the wild grasslands, who had turned tribes into a thunderous horde. And as the warm winds of the southern plains brushed against his face, he saw China not just as a target, but as a legacy waiting to be claimed. Yet the path to the east was not one to be taken lightly. China was not a single kingdom, but a vast mosaic of empires and states. To the north, the Jin dynasty reigned, its great walls standing like guardians against the wilderness. To the south, the Song dynasty basked in its golden age, a world of art, learning and trade. And in the west lay the Xixia kingdom, a land of deserts and mountains, small but fierce. For Genghis Khan, the decision was clear. He would begin with the Jin dynasty, whose wealth and arrogance made them a tempting prize. But this was not to be a mere raid or skirmish. It would be a campaign, a tidal wave that would crash upon the walls of the greatest cities in the world. And so, with the song of the southern wind at his back, the great Khan turned his gaze eastward. His riders, their banners fluttering like black wings, galloped across the plains, their hooves thundering a song of conquest. And the world would soon know the name of Genghis Khan, first as a whisper, then as a storm, the siege of Zhongdu, breaking the walls of empire, The city of Zhongdu, what the world would later know as Beijing, stood proud and defiant, its great walls rising like cliffs of stone. Beneath the shadow of those mighty walls, the city teemed with life, merchants haggling in bustling markets, scholars reciting poetry beneath the shade of ancient pavilions, and the nobles who lived in their grand mansions, secure in the belief that their walls made them invincible. But beyond those walls a new shadow had fallen, the shadow of the Mongol horde. It began as a distant rumble, a tremor that whispered through the fields and forests, but soon it grew, a rolling thunder that shook the earth, the endless march of horses, the crackle of siege engines being assembled, and the cold, sharp whisper of steel being sharpened. Genghis Khan's army was not just a force, it was a storm. Siege engines loomed like dark spectres against the horizon, their iron jaws poised to devour the city's defences. Arrows flew like flocks of dark birds, blotting out the sun, and the walls of Zhongdu trembled beneath the unrelenting assault. Defenders fought bravely. Archers lined the walls, their arrows raining down upon the Mongols. Boiling oil poured from the battlements, scorching the ground below. But the Mongols were relentless. Each breach was met with fresh waves of warriors, and each defence was broken with a cold, calculated fury. Days turned to night, and the nights bled into dawns. Fires blazed upon the walls, their crimson light casting shadows that danced like spectres. Beneath the roar of battle, the city trembled, not just from the clash of steel, but from the growing despair within its walls. Finally, the gates gave way. Mongol riders surged into the streets, their blades glinting like silver in the firelight. The defenders were swept aside, their courage shattered beneath the storm of hooves and steel. The great palaces were plundered, their silks and treasures scattered like autumn leaves in the wind. The markets became fields of ash, and the gardens
withered beneath the trampling horde. Genghis Khan stood beneath the smoking sky, his gaze cold and unyielding.
To the conquered he was a shadow, a figure who seemed to stride between the flames, unshaken, unstoppable. Zhongdu had fallen, and with it the first bastion of the east had crumbled. The fall of Xixia, a kingdom in shadows beyond the deserts. Of the west, nestled among mountains and valleys, lay the kingdom of Xixia, a realm that had long balanced between the great empires of China and the steppes. It was a land of rugged beauty, where the wind whispered through canyons and the sun set like a crimson fire behind the mountains. But it was also a land of pride, pride that would soon be shattered. Xixia had long been a tributary state of the Mongols, but when Genghis Khan called upon them for support in his campaign against the Jin dynasty, the kingdom hesitated. Perhaps they believed their mountain strongholds would protect them. Perhaps they thought distance would spare them from the wrath of the great Khan. They were wrong. Genghis Khan's army swept across the deserts like a sandstorm. Xixia's fortresses crumbled beneath the might of Mongol siege engines, their walls turned to dust. The defenders fought with courage, but they were outmatched by the discipline and fury of the Mongol warriors. Cities burned, temples were reduced to ash. The wind that had once whispered through the canyons now carried the scent of smoke and death. The royal family, once proud and defiant, was brought low, forced to bow before the great Khan, their power shattered. In the end, Xixia became a kingdom of shadows, its greatness buried beneath the dust, its legacy lost in the whispers of the wind, the path of conquest. The Mongols in the east, but the fall of Xixia was only a prelude. Genghis Khan's gaze stretched further eastward, and his armies followed like a tide, an unstoppable force that crashed upon the ancient lands of China. Cities that had stood for centuries fell like autumn leaves, their walls crumbling, their treasures plundered. The Mongols became a force of legend, riders who moved like ghosts across the land, who appeared and vanished with the wind. In each city they conquered, stories grew, tales of the great Khan whose wrath was like thunder, whose mercy was as rare as a summer snow. Ningxia, Kaifeng, Taiyuan, cities whose names were once spoken with pride, now whispered in fear.
Libraries burned, temples crumbled, and the rivers ran red with the blood of those who had dared to resist. Yet for every city that fell, a new legend was born, a legend of a man who had risen from the wild plains to become the master of empires. But
even as the flames rose, there was a strange calm in the eyes of the great Khan. To him, this was not mere conquest, it was a destiny. The winds of the steppe had whispered to him as a child, telling him of a world that stretched beyond the mountains. And now, beneath the endless sky, he had made that world his own. The sword of the East had been drawn, and the world trembled beneath its shadow. The Mongol Empire was not just an army, it was a force that would reshape the destiny of nations, a tempest that would sweep across history, leaving behind a tale of thunder and ashes. Chapter 8. The Horde Unleashed. The Invasion of Europe. The horizon trembled. Beneath the iron-grey sky, the earth seemed to shiver, its stillness broken by a distant, relentless rumble. It was a sound that began as a faint whisper, like the sigh of a distant storm. But with each passing moment, it grew louder, an unending thunder that rolled across the plains, swallowing the silence. It was not the sky that roared, but the earth itself, trembling beneath the thunder of hooves. The Mongol horde had come. Led by the brilliant strategist Subutai and the fierce commander Batu Khan, the Mongol armies swept into Eastern Europe like
a tempest. They were not just an army, they were a force of nature, an endless wave of horsemen, their faces hidden behind steel masks, their banners fluttering like dark wings against the wind, their bows curved like crescent moons, their arrows
flying with deadly precision. Each rider was a master of his horse, and together they moved as one, an ocean of warriors riding beneath the endless sky. Kingdoms that had stood for centuries now trembled at the name of the Mongols. The great princes of Eastern Europe, once secure behind their thick walls and mighty rivers, now saw their fortresses crumble like dry leaves before a storm. Villages vanished in the wake of the Mongol advance, fields became ash, and forests were stripped bare. But this was not a wild, chaotic horde. It was a force guided by the genius of Subutai, a master of strategy whose mind was a weapon sharper than any blade. Where others saw only chaos, he saw patterns. Where others saw strength, he saw weaknesses. The rivers and forests of Eastern Europe were not obstacles, they were pieces on a vast chessboard, and Subutai moved his armies with a deadly grace. In the early months of 1223, the Mongols crossed the vast steppes, their shadows stretching like dark rivers over the land. Cities that dared to resist found their walls shattered, their defenders swept aside like dust. And always, at the head of the horde, rode Batu Khan, young, fierce, and unyielding, his eyes cold as winter. The world watched in horror as the Mongol storms swept westward, and the whisper of their coming grew louder, until it became a scream. The Battle of Kalka River, the day of reckoning. It was a day when the sky seemed heavy, its grey clouds hanging low over the rolling plains. Beneath that sombre sky, two armies faced each other, one a proud alliance of Slavic princes, their banners fluttering like a sea of colours, their ranks gleaming with polished armour. The other was a vast, shadowed host, the Mongol horde, their faces shrouded in steel, their bows drawn, their horses restless beneath them. The Slavic princes had gathered their strength, a grand alliance that stretched from the distant forests of the north to the riverlands of the south. They believed their courage would hold. They believed their unity would be their shield. But they did not understand the storm that stood before them. The battle began with a fury. The Mongols surged forward, their arrows slicing through the air like falling stars. The Slavic knights, armoured in steel, lowered their lances and charged. The earth shook beneath the thunder of their advance, and for a moment it seemed they would break the Mongol line. But Subutai had planned this moment. His horsemen fell back, not in defeat, but in a calculated retreat. They drew the Slavic knights forward, away from their infantry, away from the safety of their lines. And then, with a signal like a crack of lightning, the Mongols turned. From the flanks, hidden riders emerged. Arrows flew, striking down the knights in a deadly rain. The Mongols surged forward once more, their lances flashing, their swords carving through the disorganized ranks. The alliance shattered like glass beneath a hammer. Knights who had once ridden with pride now lay broken beneath the hooves of the Mongol horde. By the banks of the Kalka River, the Slavic princes were surrounded. Some tried to flee, their horses slipping on the blood-slicked grass. Others fought, to the last, their swords rising and falling in a desperate dance. But the end was inevitable. Captured princes were taken and laid beneath the weight of wooden boards, suffocated beneath the crushing weight, their noble pride buried beneath the cold, indifferent sky. The Battle of Kalka River was over, and with it the courage of Eastern Europe lay broken, swept away like leaves before a winter wind. The siege of Kiev. A city falls in flame. Kiev, a city of golden domes and ancient walls, its streets bustling with merchants and scholars, its towers rising proudly against the sky. For centuries it had stood as a beacon of trade, of faith, and of learning, but now it stood beneath a shadow. The Mongol horde had arrived. Batu Khan and Subutai surrounded the city, their banners stretching across the horizon. Siege engines loomed like giants, their wooden frames creaking as they were prepared. The defenders of Kiev watched in horror as those engines were drawn closer, great catapults that hurled flaming boulders over the walls, battering rams that crashed against the gates, and ladders that rose like skeletal fingers toward the sky. For days the city fought. Arrows flew from the walls, striking down Mongol riders. Boiling oil poured from the battlements, scalding those who tried to climb. But the Mongols were relentless. Each day the walls grew weaker, each night the fires burned brighter. Finally, the gates fell. Mongol warriors flooded into the city, their swords flashing, their hooves thundering over the cobblestones. Homes were set alight, the golden domes blackened with smoke, and the streets became rivers of flame. The grand cathedrals, with their painted icons and sacred relics, crumbled beneath the inferno. Those who tried to flee found the gates sealed. Those who hid were dragged into the streets. The once great city of Kiev was reduced to ash and ruin, a silent, smouldering ghost beneath the grey sky, and as the smoke rose to the heavens, the world learned a brutal truth. There was no refuge from the Mongol storm. The shadow of fear. Europe's darkest hour, across Europe, a whisper turned to a murmur, and a murmur to a scream. The Mongols were coming. From the wind-swept plains of the east to the forests of the west, towns and villages trembled. Stories spread faster than the riders, tales of entire cities wiped from the earth, of kings who fell to their knees, of warriors who vanished beneath. The shadow of the horde. Merchants spoke of roads lined with the skulls of the dead. Travellers whispered of ghostly riders who appeared like shadows, striking without warning. And in the great halls of Europe, kings and nobles sat in uneasy silence, their eyes fixed on map, their fingers trembling over the eastern borders. The Mongols were not just conquerors, they were a force of terror. Cities that had stood for centuries now trembled at the mere whisper of their name. Fortresses that had once seemed invincible now seemed fragile, their walls like paper before the wind. And yet there was something even darker in the shadow that fell across Europe, a fear not just of death, but of something greater, a fear of an unstoppable force, a fear that the world they knew was ending. Beneath the smoke and the ashes, beneath the thunder of hooves and the cry of battle, a deeper truth emerged. The Mongol Empire was not just an army. It was a storm that swept across nations, that shattered empires, that left only silence in its wake. As the fires burned and the winds howled, the world watched, and in the shadow of fear it trembled. Chapter 9. The Legacy of Genghis Khan, Sons of the Great Khan. In the vast open wilderness of the Mongolian steppe, where the winds swept across the grasslands and the sky stretched endlessly above, a silence had fallen, a silence that seemed to echo across the world. Beneath the whispering winds and beneath the shadow of the sacred Birken Khaldun mountain, the greatest conqueror the world had ever known breathed his last. Genghis Khan, the great Khan of the Mongols, was gone. His final days were shrouded in mystery. Some say he was felled in battle, an arrow finding its mark. Others whispered of illness, a fever that drained his strength. There were even tales of a fall from his horse, an unthinkable fate for a man who had spent his life in the saddle, leading his people across deserts and mountains, from the frozen rivers of the north to the burning sands of the south. But in the end, it did not matter how he died. What mattered was what he left behind. As the light in his eyes faded, those who stood by his side were sworn to silence. His body was taken in secret, his resting place hidden from the world, a grave dug in the silence of the mountains, unmarked, unknown. Some say it was buried beneath a river, its waters diverted to hide the sacred ground. Others believe that his faithful warriors rode over the site, trampling it beneath their hooves to erase any trace. But even as his body vanished into legend, his shadow remained. The empire he had built stretched across the world, an ocean of steppes, deserts, forests and mountains united beneath the gaze of the eternal sky. His name was whispered in distant lands, in the halls of kings who feared his wrath, in the bazaars of merchants who spoke of his riches. The world had lost
a man, but it had gained a legend.
Genghis Khan was gone, but his spirit lived on. In the thunder of hooves, in the flutter of banners beneath the open sky, and in the hearts of his sons, who would now shape the fate of an empire. The divided throne, the struggle of succession. Even before the great Khan's body had grown cold, the seeds of conflict had begun to take root. For all his might and wisdom, Genghis Khan had left behind a problem that even he could not solve, a problem of blood, of ambition, of power. His empire was vast, but it was not a kingdom. It was a family, and at its heart were his 4 sons. Yochi, the eldest, was a fierce warrior, but his birth was clouded in shadow, a whisper of doubt that had followed him all his life. Some questioned whether he was truly Genghis Khan's son, a doubt that stung like a poisoned arrow. But he had proven his worth in battle, carving out lands in the west and earning the loyalty of his own warriors. Chagatai, the second son, was a man of fierce pride and unyielding honor. His loyalty to the law of the Mongols was absolute, his sense of justice sharp as a blade, but his pride was a double-edged sword, and his hatred for Yochi was an open wound, a rivalry that threatened the unity of the family. Ogedei, the third son, was known for his wisdom and diplomacy. He was not the fiercest warrior, but he was a man of vision, a builder, a leader who saw beyond the battlefield. To many he seemed the natural choice, a steady hand to guide the empire. And then there was Tolui, the youngest, a warrior without equal, whose loyalty to his father was beyond question. He was the keeper of the family's sacred traditions, a guardian of the old ways. But for all their strengths, the sons of Genghis Khan were not united. Old grudges festered, ambitions flared, and the shadow of their father loomed over them all. As the Mongol council gathered to decide the future, the empire trembled, not from the thunder of hooves, but from the whisper of ambition. Would the sons of the great Khan find unity? Or would the empire he built become a battlefield? Brother against brother? Blood against blood? The rise of Ogedei, the chosen. Ere, when the dust of conflict settled, a decision was made. Ogedei, the third son of Genghis Khan, was chosen to lead, a choice that brought both relief and resentment. In the great gathering of the Mongol chiefs, the Kurultai, his brothers bowed before him, their faces shadowed with thoughts unspoken. But Ogedei was not a man of cruelty. He understood the weight of his father's legacy, the vastness of the empire that stretched beneath the endless sky. His first task was to secure the loyalty of his brothers, not through fear, but through wisdom. He granted lands and titles, to each allowing them to rule their own domains. Yochi's sons were given the lands of the west, a vast frontier where their strength would be tested. Chagatai ruled the central lands, a guardian of the laws and traditions. Tolui remained by Ogedei's side, his strength a shield against any threat. Under Ogedei's rule, the Mongol Empire became something more than a war machine. Roads stretched across the steppes, linking distant lands. Cities rose, their markets bustling with merchants from every corner of the world. Scholars and diplomats came to the court of the great Khan, bringing with them knowledge, trade, and wealth. Yet beneath the surface, the shadows of ambition remained. The sons of Genghis Khan were warriors at heart, men who had grown in the saddle, whose swords had written the story of an empire. And though they bowed to Ogedei, the dream of power still burned in their hearts. But for now, there was peace, an uneasy peace, built on the wisdom of a ruler who saw not just with the eyes of a conqueror, but with the vision of a leader. The dawn of a new empire. Expansion continues. Under Ogedei's reign, the Mongol Empire did not rest. It grew, its borders stretching ever further, its armies sweeping across mountains and deserts. From the frozen rivers of the north to the burning sands of Persia, from the jungles of Indochina to the ancient cities of the Middle East, the shadow of the Mongol banner stretched across the world. New cities were founded, their streets bustling, with traders, scholars, and warriors. Postal routes crisscrossed the empire, allowing messages to travel faster than ever before. The Silk Road flourished, its caravans laden with spices, silk, and silver, a world that had once been a tapestry
of divided kingdoms now became a single, vast marketplace, an empire where the wealth of nations flowed like rivers. But with power came danger.
The Mongol armies were a force of steel and fire, but they were also a storm that could turn upon itself. Ogedei's rule brought prosperity, but beneath the surface, the old rivalries simmered. His brothers remained powerful, their armies loyal, not to the empire, but to their own bloodlines. And yet, for all its shadows, the Mongol Empire was a miracle, a realm where knowledge travelled as swiftly as the wind, where cultures met and mingled beneath the watchful sky. The name of Genghis Khan became not just a memory, but a legend, an echo that whispered in the winds of the steppe, a shadow that stretched across the world. And at its heart was Ogedei, the chosen heir, the ruler who sought to turn his father's legacy into a realm that would endure. But even as the dawn of a new empire rose, a question remained. Would the sons of the great Khan build upon his legacy? Or would their own ambitions tear it apart? The winds whispered, but they gave no answer.
Only time would tell.
Chapter 10. The Empire's Golden Age, the Rule of Kublai Khan. In the vast wind-swept plains of Mongolia, where the sky stretched endlessly and the grass danced like waves beneath the eternal blue, a young boy was born. A boy who would one day become a legend. His name was Kublai, the grandson of Genghis Khan, the child of the steppe, and yet a soul who would one day rule a world beyond the wild horizons. From the moment he could walk, Kublai was taught the ways of his people. He learned to ride before. He could speak, his tiny hands gripping the mane of a wild pony as it raced across the endless grasslands. He learned to draw a bow, his arrows slicing through the wind, striking their mark with the unerring precision of a true Mongol warrior. But Kublai was more than just a child of the steppe. He was a child of two worlds. Unlike many of his brothers, who revelled in the freedom of the open plains, Kublai was drawn to stories, stories of distant lands, of grand cities where towers rose like mountains of scholars who spent their lives seeking knowledge. As he grew, his mind became a bridge between the fierce, untamed spirit of the steppe and the wisdom of the ancient world beyond. His mother, Sorghaghtani Beki, was a woman of great wisdom and ambition. She taught Kublai that a true ruler was not just a warrior, but a thinker, a man who could command armies, but also build cities, who could conquer lands, but also rule them with wisdom and justice. Under her guidance, Kublai's curiosity grew. He listened to the stories of travelers who came from China, from Persia, from the distant lands of India. He learned of empires that rose and fell, of philosophers who wrote great books, of artists who painted the world in colors beyond imagination. But even as he learned, Kublai never forgot his roots. He rode with his brothers, hunted beneath the wide sky, and trained with the warriors of the steppe. His soul was both wild and wise, fierce and thoughtful, a reflection of the two worlds that shaped him. And as the years passed, the boy became
a man who would not just follow in the footsteps of his grandfather Genghis Khan, but would carve a new path of his own.
a path that would lead him to the very heart of a world beyond the mountains, a world known as China. The conquest of China, the Yuan dynasty, begins. The distant land of China was a world of endless wonders, a land where rivers flowed like silver, where mountains rose like emerald walls, where cities gleamed beneath the sun, their streets alive with merchants, scholars, and nobles. It was a land of ancient dynasties, a realm of great wealth and greater wisdom. But for Kublai Khan, it was also a land divided, a realm weakened by the struggles of the Song dynasty, whose emperors clung to their thrones even as their power crumbled. And for Kublai, the path was clear. China was not just a prize, it was a destiny. With the wisdom of a strategist and the strength of a conqueror, Kublai led his armies south. His warriors were not just riders of the steppe, they were a force of iron, a thunderous wave that swept across the rivers and mountains. City after city fell, their walls crumbling beneath the relentless assault of Mongol siege engines. From the Yangtze River to the Pearl River, the Song resistance was fierce, but it was like a forest struggling against a storm. The great city of Xiangyang became the first to fall, its walls shattered by the might of Mongol catapults, its defenders swept away by the tide of conquest. The Song emperors retreated, their armies scattered like leaves in the wind. And as the Mongol banners rose above the walls of the great cities, Kublai's dream became a reality. In 1271 he declared himself Emperor of China, establishing the Yuan dynasty, a new era where the descendants of the steppe ruled the Middle Kingdom. But Kublai was not content with mere conquest. For him, China was not just a land to be taken, it was a land to be transformed, a world to be embraced. And so beneath the shadow of his banners a new age dawned, the age of the Yuan dynasty. Mongol throne in the Middle Kingdom. The imperial vision, as the Emperor of China, Kublai Khan was not just a conqueror, he was a builder, a dreamer, a ruler who saw beyond the battlefield. His capital was not a tent on the open plains, but a city of marble and gold, a city called Dadu, known today as Beijing. Here he built a grand palace, its walls shimmering like white jade, its gardens blooming with flowers from every corner
of the empire. But Kublai was not just a Mongol ruler in a Chinese land, he was something more.
He embraced the wisdom of China, surrounding himself with scholars, philosophers, and scientists. He adopted Chinese customs, honored the ancient traditions, and filled his court with poets, artists, and astronomers. Confucian scholars debated. In his halls, while Persian astronomers mapped the stars from his observatories. Yet even as he embraced the wisdom of China, he did not forget his Mongol heritage. His court was a place where silk-robed scholars walked beside fur-clad warriors, where the songs of the steppe mingled with the melodies of the zither, where Mongol horsemen guarded the gates of a city that stretched to the horizon. Kublai's rule became a bridge between the world of the nomads and the world of the scholars, between the sword and the scroll. And in that bridge he built an empire unlike any other, an empire where the traditions of the steppe danced with the wisdom of the Middle Kingdom. But even as his power grew, shadows lingered. Some of his own people saw him as a man who had lost his way, a ruler who had traded the freedom of the steppe for the grandeur of the palace. And in the far corners of the empire, whispers grew, whispers of rebellion, of rival Khans who watched with envy as Kublai's star rose ever higher. Today's height of power, an empire of riches and ideas, under Kublai Khan's rule, the Mongol Empire reached heights of wealth and wisdom that the world had never seen. The Silk Road, that ancient path of trade and culture, flourished beneath his watch. Caravans travelled from the deserts of Persia to the cities of China, their goods gleaming in the sunlight, silks of the finest weave, spices whose scents filled the air, gems that sparkled like fallen stars. But it was not just goods that travelled those roads, it was knowledge. Scholars came from Persia, bringing with them the wisdom of the stars. Merchants from Venice spoke of distant lands across the sea. Monks travelled from India, sharing their teachings of peace and meditation. The world seemed to flow through Kublai's court, a river of ideas, of art, of science. The Grand Canal was expanded, a vast waterway that linked the cities of the north and south, a path of trade that glittered beneath the sun. Paper money flowed through the markets, a marvel that brought wealth to the cities and the villages alike. But even as Kublai's empire flourished, shadows gathered. The weight of his conquests, the burden of ruling a realm so vast, began to press upon him. Rebellions simmered in distant provinces. The lords of the steppe whispered of a Khan who had forgotten the ways of his ancestors. Yet beneath the jade roofs of his palaces, beneath the golden light of the setting sun, Kublai Khan looked out over his empire, a realm that stretched from the frozen rivers of Siberia to the warm seas of the south, from the mountains of Persia to the islands of Japan. He was the great Khan of the Mongols, the Emperor of China, the bridge between worlds. And in his heart he carried the dream of his grandfather, a dream of a world united beneath the open sky. But even as his star shone bright, the winds of fate whispered of a storm yet to come. Chapter 11. The Shadow of Decline, Fractured Thrones. Beneath the vast cold skies of the Mongolian steppe, where the wind whispered like a distant lament, an era came to an end. Kublai Khan, the great Khan of the Mongols, the Emperor of China, breathed his last. In the grand halls of Dadu, his imperial capital, the light of his life flickered and faded, a light that had once shone across the world. Kublai Khan's final days were marked by sorrow. His empire, once a realm of endless riches and wisdom, now strained beneath the weight of its own grandeur. The cities he had built, the roads that stretched across mountains and deserts, the palaces of white jade and gold, all of it seemed to press down upon him. His health withered, his spirit dulled, and the fire in his eyes dimmed. When he finally closed his eyes, a shadow fell across the empire he had forged. His courtiers wept, his generals bowed their heads, but beneath the veil of mourning, a deeper truth lingered. Kublai's death was not just the passing of a man, but the breaking of a chain that had once held the empire together. His successors were not men of his strength or wisdom. His sons and grandsons, raised in the splendor of the palace, knew little of the fierce, wind-swept plains that had given birth to the Mongol spirit. They were rulers in name, but their hands were weak upon the reins of power. Rivalries flared. Corruption spread like a silent poison. The court became a place of whispers and plots, where ministers jostled for favor and generals eyed one another with suspicion. In the distant provinces, governors ruled as kings in all but name, their loyalty a fading memory. The Yuan dynasty, the empire that Kublai had built, began to fracture, not with a crash, but with a whisper, a slow, steady decay that spread through its bones. The great Khan was gone, and with him the light of unity began to fade. The rise of the Khanates, an empire. Divided beyond the walls of China, the shadow of decline spread further. The Mongol Empire, once a single, unstoppable force that swept across mountains, deserts, and rivers, now fractured like glass struck by a silent, unseen hand. From the ashes of unity, 4 great Khanates rose, each a fragment of the vast empire that had once stretched from the steppes of Mongolia to the shores of the Mediterranean. In the west, the Golden Horde stood proud beneath the iron skies of the Russian plains. Founded by Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, it was a land of fierce horsemen who ruled over the forests and rivers of Eastern Europe. The cities of Kiev and Moscow bowed before its might, their princes paying tribute to the Khan who sat upon his throne by the Volga River. To the south, the Ilkhanate stretched across the mountains and deserts of Persia, a realm of rich cities and ancient wisdom. Founded by Hulagu Khan, another grandson of Genghis Khan, it was a land of scholars and merchants where the teachings of Islam mingled with the traditions of the Mongols. But even here, the shadow of division grew as rival families vied for power. In the heart of Asia, the Chagatai Khanate rose, a land of mountains and steppe, where the fierce traditions of the Mongols clashed with the wisdom of the ancient Silk Road. It was a realm where the sons of Genghis Khan's second son, Chagatai, struggled for dominance, their rivalries like wildfires that swept across the plains. And in the east, the Yuan dynasties stood, the realm of Kublai Khan, a vast and ancient land where Mongol rulers sat upon the dragon throne of China. But here, too, the light had dimmed. The emperors of the Yuan grew weak, their court corrupted, their armies restless. Once a single empire, the Mongol world had become a shattered mirror, each fragment reflecting a different dream, each Khanate a kingdom of its own. Brothers became rivals, allies turned to enemies, and the unity of the Mongol spirit faded like a dying flame beneath the open sky. The Black Death, a plague of shadows. Yet even as the Khanates turned upon one another, a darker shadow fell upon the world, a shadow that swept across mountains and seas, carried by the winds of fate. It began in the east, in the bustling markets of China, in the crowded ports where merchants came and went, their ships heavy with spices and silk. But with those ships came something else, Something unseen, something deadly. The Black Death, it travelled along the trade routes that the Mongols had built, the Silk Road, the Grand Canal, the caravan trails that stretched across mountains and deserts. Merchants who once brought wealth and wisdom now carried death. Rats scurried through the holds of ships, their fur alive with fleas, and those fleas carried a plague, a silent, invisible killer that spread faster than any army. In the towns and villages of Persia, men and women fell sick, their skin darkening, with blackened sores. In the great cities of Europe, the bells of churches rang out, tolling for the dead who lay in the streets. And in the shadowed yurts of the steppe, even the Mongols, whose horses had carried them to the ends of the earth, could not escape the touch of the plague. The world that had once seemed so vast now seemed small, a world where death rode with the wind, where the roads that had brought wealth and knowledge now became paths of sorrow. The Mongol Empire, whose armies had swept across continents, now watched helplessly as an unseen enemy swept across the world they had conquered. And beneath the white shadow of the plague, the light of the Mongol legacy grew dim. A dying flame. The Yuan dynasties fall in the land of China, where once Kublai Khan had ruled in splendor. The flame of the Yuan dynasty began to flicker. The emperors who sat upon the dragon throne were not men of strength. They were shadows, their words whispered by corrupt ministers, their armies loyal only to gold. Taxes rose, the burden falling upon the weary peasants who toiled in the fields.
Famine spread. The rivers that once flowed with silver now ran dry.
And in the cities, the streets filled with the cries of the hungry, the desperate, the forgotten. Rebellion whispered through the mountains like a spark that danced in the wind. Secret societies formed, their members speaking of justice, of freedom, of a world without the Mongol yoke. Among them rose a figure who would become a legend, a peasant named Zhu Yuanzhang, who would one day drive the Mongols from China and build a new dynasty, the Ming. In the year 1368, the walls of Dadu, the great capital built by Kublai Khan, trembled. The rebel armies swept forward, their banners like a storm cloud on the horizon. The Mongol emperor fled, his court scattering like leaves before the wind. And as the sun set behind the mountains, the Yuan dynasty fell, its palaces abandoned, its streets silent. The Mongols, who had once ruled from the frozen rivers of Siberia to the warm seas of the south, now became wanderers, nomads once more, cast out of the empire they had built. And beneath the whispering winds of the steppe, the shadow of Genghis Khan stretched once more, a memory of a world that had risen like a storm and now faded like a dream. But even as the Yuan fell, the legacy of the Mongols lived on, not just in the ashes of their cities, but in the roads they built, the knowledge they spread, the world they had changed forever. For the empire of the Mongols was more than land. It was a dream that rose and fell beneath the endless sky. Chapter 12. The Horde of the West. The Golden Horde's Reign. The wind howled across the frozen plains of the north, a bitter chill that seemed to claw at the earth itself. But beneath that iron sky, a greater storm moved, a storm of hooves and steel, of banners that rippled like shadows, of riders whose breath steamed in the frosty air. It was the Golden Horde, the relentless, unstoppable force led by Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. From the steppes of Mongolia to the great rivers of the Rus, the Golden Horde swept like a thunderous wave. Batu Khan was not just a conqueror, he was a force of nature, a commander whose name became a whisper of terror in the towns and villages of the Russian lands. He did not simply ride to plunder, he rode to conquer, to bring the vast snow-covered forests of the Rus beneath the shadow of his banners. In the winter of 1237, the Golden Horde crossed the frozen rivers, their horses galloping across ice that cracked beneath their weight. City after city fell beneath their relentless advance. Ryazan was the first to burn, its wooden walls crumbling in the flames, its people scattering before the storm. The city of Kolomna followed, its defenders swept away by a tide of horsemen. But the true heart of the conquest was Vladimir, the city whose grand cathedrals and golden domes rose above the snow-covered fields. Beneath the grey sky, the Mongols
laid siege. Fire rained down upon the rooftops, and the great cathedral itself was consumed in flame.
The defenders, brave but outmatched, fell beneath the hooves of the Golden Horde, and then came Moscow, a town of wooden walls and narrow streets, a city that stood in the shadow of greater powers. Here, too, the Mongols brought fire and sword. The wooden gates crumbled, the streets filled with the cries of the dying. Smoke rose to the heavens, a dark cloud that spread across the horizon. The princes of the Rus, who once quarrelled among themselves, now trembled before the name of Batu Khan. Those who submitted were spared, paying tribute in silver and fur. Those who resisted vanished beneath the shadow of the Horde. The land of the Rus had become a realm of ashes, its rivers choked with the wreckage of broken cities. But even in the midst of destruction, a whisper of hope remained, a whisper that would grow in the shadow of the Horde. The princes of Moscow. A city rises from the ashes, amid the ruins and the smoking fields. One city began to rise, not with pride, but with patience. It was Moscow, a town that had once been little more than a cluster of wooden houses beside a winding river. But in the shadow of the Golden Horde, Moscow became something more. It became a refuge, a haven for those who fled the fury of the Mongol storm. The princes of Moscow were not mighty warlords, nor were they great warriors. But they were clever, they were patient, and above all, they were loyal not just to their people, but to the Mongol Khan. When Batu Khan demanded tribute, Moscow paid. When the Horde demanded soldiers, Moscow sent them. And in return, the city was spared the worst of the devastation. But beneath this loyalty was a quiet ambition, a dream of something greater. While other cities burned, Moscow grew. Its princes expanded their lands, bought villages from neighboring lords, and welcomed refugees from the shattered towns. They became the collectors of tribute for the Golden Horde, a position that brought them wealth and power. Ivan Kalita, known as Ivan Moneybag, became the symbol of this cunning strategy. He did not fight the Horde, he served it, but as he served, he gathered silver, he built stone churches where once there had been wooden chapels, and he laid the foundations of a city that would one day become a great capital. And as Moscow grew, so did the dream of a free Rus. A dream whispered in the dark corners of the churches, in the hidden chambers of the princes. A dream that one day the Horde would fall and Russia would be free. In the shadow of the Golden Horde, Moscow became more than a city. It became a seed that would one day become an empire. The Battle of Kulikovo, the first defeat. Morning mist hung low over the fields of Kulikovo, a silver fog that clung to the earth like a veil. Beneath that mist, an army gathered, a host of Russian princes, their banners fluttering in the cold wind, their swords drawn, their faces set with grim resolve. At their head rode Dmitri Donskoy, the Prince of Moscow, a man who dared to defy. The Golden Horde. For years, the princes of Russia had bent beneath the yoke of the Horde, paying tribute in silver and suffering beneath the shadow of Mongol might. But now they had come together, not as rivals, but as brothers. They came not just to fight, but to defy, to strike a blow against the power that had cast its shadow over their land. The fog lifted, and across the field they saw them, the army of the Golden Horde, their horsemen arrayed like a dark sea, their banners rippling in the wind. At their head rode Mamai, the Mongol general, a man whose name was whispered with fear across the land. The battle began with a roar, a clash of steel and the thunder of hooves. The Mongol riders swept forward, their arrows slicing through the mist. But the Russian knights stood firm, their shields locked, their spears bristling like a forest of iron. For hours the battle raged. Men fell in the mud, their cries lost in the fury of the storm. But the courage of the Russian princes did not break. In the midst of the chaos, Dmitri Donskoy led his warriors, his banner rising like a beacon in the mist. And then, with a final, desperate charge, the Russians broke the Mongol line. The horde retreated, their riders vanishing like shadows in the twilight. The field of Kulikovo was soaked in blood, but it was a victory that would be remembered, a victory that whispered of hope. For the first time, the Golden Horde
had been defeated. And in the shadow of that defeat, a new spirit was born, a spirit of defiance, a spirit of freedom. The slow decline, the last days of the Horde. But even as the Golden Horde burned and plundered, even as its riders swept
across the forests and fields of Russia, the seeds of its decline were already sown. The Horde, once a force of iron and fire, became a realm of shadows, torn by rivalry, weakened by ambition. The Khanate fractured. Powerful nobles, once loyal to the Khan, now turned upon one another. Rival Khans claimed the throne, their armies, clashing in the empty steppe. The great city of Sarai, once a bustling centre of trade and power, became a ghost, a city of silent markets and empty streets. And in the north, the princes of Moscow watched. They did not rise in open rebellion, not yet. They bided their time, growing stronger with each passing year. Their armies grew, their walls rose, their silver flowed like a river. In 1480 the final blow came. At the Ugra River, the Golden Horde confronted the army of Moscow once more. But there was no battle, only a silent standoff. The Mongol riders stared across the river, their faces hidden behind steel masks. And then, without a word, they turned and rode away. The yoke of the Horde was broken, not with a clash of swords, but with a whisper. The Golden Horde, once the terror of the Rus, faded into the mist of history. Its banners, which had once cast a shadow over the forests and rivers, now lay forgotten beneath the whispering winds of the steppe. And in the heart of Russia, a new power rose, a power that would one day become an empire of its own, the Mongol. Shadow had passed, but in its place a new light began to shine, a light that would one day be called Russia. Chapter 13. The Silk Road Reborn. The Mongol Trade Empire. Beneath the endless sky, where the wind whispered across the wide, open steppes, there stretched a path that wound through deserts of burning sand, over mountains crowned with snow and across valleys that bloomed with life. It was a path as old as civilization itself, a road of whispers and wonders, of merchants and mystics, a road that connected worlds. It was the Silk Road. But for centuries, this ancient highway had lain in shadows. Bandits haunted its lonely stretches, feuding warlords demanded tribute, and merchants travelled in fear, their caravans huddled close like ships on a dark sea. Trade had become a game of risk, and knowledge flowed like a trickle instead of a river. But then came the Mongols. Under the vast empire of the great Khan, the Silk Road was reborn. What had once been a fragile thread became a golden highway, a path of wealth and wisdom that stretched from the bustling bazaars of China to the grand markets of Persia, from the glittering palaces of Constantinople to the crowded streets of Venice. Merchants who had once travelled in fear now journeyed beneath the shadow of Mongol banners, their caravans moving like rivers of silk and spice. The Mongols did not merely allow trade, they encouraged it. They cleared the roads of bandits, built way stations where weary travellers could rest, and established a network of post houses where messages could travel faster than ever before. Roads stretched across mountains and deserts, their routes guarded by Mongol patrols. The great Khan declared that merchants were to be honoured, not robbed, that scholars were to be welcomed, not silenced. In the bustling markets of Samarkand, silks from China flowed like rivers of colour, their shimmering threads woven with the secrets of distant lands. Spices from India filled the air with their rich, fragrant scent, while pearls from the Gulf sparkled in the sunlight. Persian carpets, with their intricate patterns, covered the floors of grand palaces, while glassware from Venice glittered beneath the lanterns of the Khan's court. The Silk Road was not just a path for goods, it was a path for ideas. Monks travelled from the mountains of Tibet carrying their teachings of peace and meditation. Scholars came from Persia bringing the wisdom of the stars. Astronomers from the Islamic world mapped the heavens, their charts spreading across libraries, from Baghdad to Beijing. And at the heart of it all were the Mongols, rulers who did not see themselves as mere conquerors, but as guardians of a world united by trade, by knowledge, by the whisper of the wind across the steppe. Safe passage. The promise of the Khan, but the Silk Road, did not thrive by chance. It thrived because of a promise made by the great Khan and enforced by his iron will. It was the promise of safe passage across the vast expanse of the Mongol Empire, from the frozen rivers of the north to the burning deserts of the south. One law was sacred, the Yasa, the code of the Khan. It was a code that declared that all who travelled beneath the shadow of the Mongol banners were to be protected, whether they were merchants, scholars, or pilgrims. Those who dared to harm them would answer to the wrath of the Khan. Caravans that had once crept through the mountains now travelled with confidence, their merchants riding beneath the protection of the Mongol army. At the great caravanserais, vast inns that rose like islands in the desert, travellers rested, their camels drinking from wide stone troughs, their goods stacked beneath the shade of palm trees. The Mongol postal system, the yam, became a marvel of the world, a network of stations, where couriers changed horses, carrying messages faster than any king's messenger. A letter could travel from the mountains of Persia to the gates of Beijing in a matter of weeks, its words a thread that wove together a world that had once been divided. But the promise of the Khan was more than just a law. It was a shield, a whispered assurance that the roads of the empire were safe, that knowledge could travel as freely as the wind. The scholars of Baghdad exchanged letters with the astronomers of China, their ideas carried along the same paths that bore silks and spices. Monks from Tibet walked beside merchants from Venice, their robes fluttering like the wings of birds, and beneath the watchful eyes of the Mongol patrols, the world became a place of wonder, a place where a traveller could see the blue domes of Samarkand, the golden roofs of Beijing, and the marble minarets of Isfahan, all in a single lifetime. It was a world where a promise was not just a word, but a bond between the Khans and the dream of a world united, a bridge of cultures, knowledge without borders. But the Silk Road was not just a highway of wealth, it was a bridge of cultures, a river of knowledge that flowed across
mountains and deserts.
Beneath the shadow of the Mongol banners, scholars met in bustling cities, their minds dancing like the flames of 1,000 candles. In the grand city of Maraha, in the heart of Persia, the great observatory of Nasir al-Din al-Tusi rose against the sky, a place where astronomers mapped the stars, where scholars from China and the Islamic world worked side by side. They shared their knowledge of the heavens, their charts filled with the secrets of the cosmos. In the bustling markets of Samarkand, Persian poets recited verses beside Chinese artists who painted scenes of mountains and rivers. In the libraries of Baghdad, Mongol, scribes translated the works of Greek philosophers, their pages filled with the wisdom of Aristotle and Plato. The Mongols were not just warriors, they were patrons of knowledge, guardians of wisdom. They welcomed scholars to their courts, listened to the stories of travelers who came from distant lands. They built libraries where the scrolls of China sat beside the books of Persia, where the teachings of the Buddha were read beside the words of the Quran. And in this world without borders, ideas flowed like rivers, rivers that carried the light of knowledge from one land to another. Paper, a secret of China, spread to the Middle East, where it transformed the art of writing. The compass, a gift of the East, found its way to the West, guiding ships across distant seas. Even the foods of the world travelled along the Silk Road. Rice from China appeared on the tables of Persia, while spices from India flavoured the dishes of distant lands. Silk, that shimmering thread of the East, became a symbol of wealth, its soft, delicate fabric flowing across the courts of Europe. The Silk Road was not just a path of wealth, it was a path of wonder, a bridge that connected the minds and hearts of the world. The empire of commerce, prosperity, for all, under the rule of the Mongols, the world became a marketplace where the wealth of nations flowed like rivers, where traders spoke 1,000 tongues beneath the shadow of great city walls. It was an empire not just of steel and conquest, but of commerce. In the great city of Karakoram, the capital of the Mongol Empire, merchants came from every corner of the world. The bazaars were filled with silks from China, spices from India, silver from Persia, and glassware from Venice. Gold coins changed hands beneath the bright canopies, their glittering light a promise of wealth. But it was not just the great cities that thrived. Villages along the Silk Road saw new life, their markets bustling with merchants, their streets filled with the scent of spices, the shimmer of silk. Farmers grew rich, selling grain to the caravans. Blacksmiths forged the iron that became the weapons of the Mongol armies, and weavers spun the threads that clothed the merchants who travelled the world. The Mongol Empire was not just a realm of warriors, it was a realm of wealth, a world where the treasures of one land became the wonders of another. A world where a merchant could trade a bolt of silk for a sack of spices, where a scholar could teach the secrets of the stars in a distant city, where a traveller could see the wonders of the world and carry them home. It was a world where the dreams of one land became the treasures of another. A world where the roads of the Mongols became paths of wonder, paths of gold, and beneath the endless sky the Silk Road shimmered, a golden thread that wove together the world. Chapter 14. The Secrets of Mongol Warfare, a Mastery of Strategy. The wind swept across the open plains, carrying with it a whisper that spoke of thunder, of storms that rose not from the sky, but from the earth itself. And beneath, that endless sky where the grass danced like waves beneath the breeze, a shadow moved, a shadow of hooves of steel, of banners that fluttered like dark wings. It was the Mongol horde, and it came like lightning. To understand the power of the Mongols was to understand the power of speed. They were not an army that marched, they were a storm that rode. Their horsemen, clad in leather armour, their bows, slung across their backs, moved faster than any force the world had ever known. They could cover vast distances in days, crossing deserts where other armies would perish, fording rivers with their horses swimming beneath them. But their speed was more than just the swiftness of their horses, it was the swiftness of their
minds. The Mongol commanders were masters of strategy, men who saw the battlefield not as a place of chaos, but as a game of shadows and wind. They struck without warning, their arrows falling like rain upon the unprepared.
villages that slept beneath the starlit sky awoke to the sound of thunder, the thunder of hooves, the cries of men caught in the storm. The Mongols did not simply advance, they appeared. Their scouts, riding far ahead of the main force, moved, like ghosts across the mountains and forests, mapping the land, counting the enemy's numbers, learning the hidden paths. And when the time came, the Mongol army seemed to rise out of the earth itself, striking with a fury that shattered even the strongest defences, and yet, when their enemies tried to strike back, they found nothing, only the empty plains, the wind whispering over the grass. For the Mongols did not just appear like a storm, they vanished like one. They would attack a city, and before the defenders could muster their strength, they would be gone, their horsemen riding into the mist, leaving only ashes and fear. The Mongols were not just warriors, they were whispers of thunder, shadows of steel. They were the storm on the steppe, and their lightning struck without warning. The art of deception, feigned retreats and ambushes. But it was not just their speed that made the Mongols unstoppable, it was their mastery of deception. The Mongols were more than warriors, they were tricksters, masters of illusion, who turned the battlefield into a stage where they wrote their own stories of victory. One of their greatest tricks was the feigned retreat, a tactic that turned the courage of their enemies into a deadly trap. The battle would begin with the Mongol horsemen riding forward, their arrows raining down like a storm. And then, as their enemies advanced, the Mongols would turn and flee. But this was no retreat, it was a dance, a deadly dance that drew the enemy forward, away from their fortifications, away from their support. Driven by pride, by anger, by the belief that they were winning, the enemy would charge forward, their formations breaking, their lines scattered. And then, with a signal like a crack of lightning, the Mongols would turn, from the flanks hidden.
Riders would emerge, arrows slicing through the air, cutting down the disorganized ranks. The fleeing horsemen would turn, their bows drawn, their arrows flying in deadly volleys.
The hunters became the hunted. The proud warriors who had thought they were victorious now found themselves trapped, their courage shattered beneath the thunder of hooves. But the Mongols did not rely on tricks alone. They used their cunning to create entire illusions. They would light campfires across the hills, making their army seem vast beyond counting. They would send small forces to attack from one side, drawing the enemy's attention, while the main force swept in from another. They used the land itself
as a weapon, leading their enemies into deserts, into forests, into swamps, where they would be surrounded and destroyed. They were not just warriors, they were shadows that danced upon the wind, whispers that turned pride into a weapon.
A storm that struck where it was least expected. The siege masters. Walls become graves, but even the strongest walls could not protect against the Mongols. For all their speed, for all their cunning, the Mongols were not just raiders of the plains, they were masters of siege. Cities that had stood for centuries fell beneath their shadow, their walls crumbling like sand before the fury of the storm. The Mongols understood that a siege was not just a test of strength, it was a test of the mind, a game of patience, of terror, of whispers in the night. When they came to the gates of a city, they did not simply attack, they watched, they waited, they whispered. First came the messengers, riders, who offered the city a choice. Surrender, and your people will be spared. Resist, and your city will become a grave. Many cities, seeing the vastness of the Mongol horde, surrendered without a fight. But those that dared to resist saw the true fury of the Mongols. Siege engines loomed like iron giants against the sky, catapults that hurled stones and flaming oil over the walls, battering rams that shattered the gates, towers that rose like shadows, their ladders reaching for the battlements. Beneath the walls, sappers dug tunnels, collapsing the foundations, bringing the mighty towers crashing down. But the Mongols were not just engineers, they were masters of fear. They sent prisoners to the walls, their bodies marked with the scars of torture, their eyes empty with despair. A silent message that spoke of the fate of those who resisted. They catapulted the bodies of the dead over the walls, spreading disease and terror. They filled the night with the sound of drums, the roar of their chants, the whispers of their scouts. And when the walls fell, the storm swept in. Those who had fought were cut down, the city's treasures plundered, its streets filled with smoke and ash. But those who surrendered were spared, treated not as enemies, but as subjects of the great Khan. For the Mongols were not just conquerors, they were rulers. They destroyed only those who defied them. And in that destruction they built the foundation of their power. The code of discipline, the unbreakable bond of loyalty. But beneath the lightning of their speed, beneath the shadows of their deception, beneath the fury of their sieges lay a deeper strength, a strength that bound the Mongol armies together, that made them not just a horde, but a brotherhood. It was the Yasa, the sacred code of the Khan. The Yasa was more than just a law, it was a promise a promise of loyalty, of discipline, of unity. It declared that every man, from the highest general to the youngest rider, was equal in the eyes of the Khan. Plunder was to be shared, rewards given to the brave, punishments swift and severe. Betrayal was met with death, cowardice with shame. A warrior who fled from battle would be executed, not just to punish him, but to protect the honor of the horde. A commander who mistreated his men would be cast down, his place taken by one who earned their loyalty. But the yasa was not just a code of punishment, it was a code of brotherhood. In the Mongol camp, the rich and the poor ate the same food, drank the same water. A Khan sat beside his men, shared their hardships, rode beside them into battle. They were not just an army, they were a family, and this discipline, this bond of brotherhood made the Mongol horde more than a force. It made them a legend. No city was too strong, no fortress too high, no army too vast, for the Mongols did not fight as men, they fought as one. Under the endless sky, beneath the whispering winds of the steppe, they rode as a single storm, lightning and shadow, fury and cunning, a brotherhood that swept across the world. The Mongol warriors were not just soldiers, they were the thunder of the earth, the storm that rose from the plains. And beneath their banners they carried not just swords and arrows, but the dream of a world conquered, a world ruled, a world that trembled beneath their shadow. Chapter 15. The Women of the Empire. The Hidden Pillars of Power. Hoelun, the mother who shaped an empire. Beneath the endless sky of the Mongolian steppe, where the winds whispered through the tall, waving grass, a woman rode alone. Her name was Hoelun, and she was not just a mother. She was the beginning of an empire. Hoelun's life began with a tale of loss. She was a young woman taken from her first husband by a warrior named Yasuge, who claimed her as his bride. But in Tig's, this harsh world where strength was survival, Hoelun found herself not a queen, but a widow. Her husband was poisoned by his enemies and she was left alone, cast out with her young children, left to the mercy of the wild. But Hoelun was no ordinary woman. Beneath her gentle eyes burned a fierce will, a spirit forged in the winds of the steppe. As the seasons turned, as the winter winds howled and the rivers froze, she did not falter. Her children, hungry and cold, clung to her, their faces pale with fear. But Hoelun did not despair. She taught them to hunt, to fish in the frozen streams, to gather roots and herbs from the forest. She became their shield, their guide, their light in the darkness. One of those children was named Temujin, a boy who would one day become Genghis Khan. But before he was a Khan, he was a son who watched his mother struggle against the cruelty of the world. He saw her courage, her strength, her quiet wisdom, and from her he learned the lessons that would shape his destiny. He learned that strength was not just a matter of steel, but of spirit. He learned that loyalty was a bond stronger than any chain. Hoelun did not ride into battle. She did not wield a sword, but she was the heart of the tribe, the quiet voice that whispered of courage in the darkest nights. And when Temujin rose, when he gathered his followers, when he carved an empire from the wild plains, he carried with him the spirit of his mother, the spirit of Holun, the woman who shaped a conqueror. Her story was not written in blood or steel, but in the whispers of the wind, in the quiet strength of a mother who turned a child of the steppe into a man who would change the world. Sorghaghtani Beki. The wise queen, but Holun, was not the only woman who shaped the destiny of the Mongols. In the grand halls of power, in the glittering courts where warriors and nobles bowed before the Khan, another woman stood, a woman whose wisdom shone like a flame in the darkness. Her name was Sorghaghtani Beki. Sorghaghtani Beki was not just a queen, she was a strategist, a diplomat, a mother whose ambition was matched only by her brilliance. She was the wife of Tolui, the youngest son of Genghis Khan, but her influence stretched far beyond the shadow of her husband. For when Tolui died, it was Sorghaghtani who took his place, not as a ruler, but as a guide, a guardian of his sons. She was the mother of 4 sons, Mongol, Kublai, Hulagu, and Arik Berke. And it was her vision, her wisdom, that guided them to power. Where other mothers saw their sons as children, Sorghaghtani saw them as kings, as conquerors, as leaders who would shape the world. But she did not raise them with pride, she raised them with patience, with humility, with wisdom. She taught them to respect the scholars, to listen to the wise, to rule not just with strength, but with justice. When others sought to hoard power, she shared it. When rival princes whispered of rebellion, she forged alliances. And in the great council of the Mongols, her voice was a whisper that moved empires. Her greatest triumph came when her son Kublai became the great Khan, the ruler of China, the founder of the Yuan dynasty. But even as her sons rose to power, Sorghaghtani remained in the shadows, an advisor, a guide, a woman whose quiet words carried the weight of empires. She did not ride into battle, she did not wear a crown, but she ruled with a wisdom that turned kings into legends. Sorghaghtani Beki was more than a queen. She was the mind behind the throne, the silent hand that shaped the destiny of the Mongol Empire. The warrior queens, women who fought for glory, but not all Mongol women ruled from the shadows. Some rode into battle, their swords flashing in the sunlight, their faces fierce beneath their helmets. They were the warrior queens, women who fought, who conquered, who carved their names into the bones of history. Among them was Kutulun, the great-granddaughter
of Genghis Khan, a woman whose strength became a legend.
She was not just a princess, she was a warrior, whose prowess in battle struck fear into the hearts of her enemies. Kutulun was known not just for her skill with the bow, but for her strength in wrestling, a tradition among the Mongols. She challenged any man who sought her hand to defeat her in a match, and none could. Riding at the head of her own army, she charged into battle beside her father, her arrows flying with deadly precision. Her warriors followed her not because she was a princess, but because she was a leader who stood in the front lines, who fought with the strength of 10 men. There were others, too, women who led their tribes, who defended their people
against the storms of war, women who carried swords beside their husbands, who stood as shields for their children.
They were not queens of silks and jewels, they were queens of iron and fire, women whose courage burned like a flame. These warrior queens did not hide behind the walls of palaces. They rode beneath the open sky, their banners fluttering like the wings of eagles, their swords singing beneath the endless blue. The silent power, women behind the throne, but not all power is carried on the edge of a sword. For beyond the battlefield, beyond the councils of the Khans, there was another kind of power, a silent power that whispered in the shadows, a power that flowed through the veins of the Mongol Empire like a hidden river. Mongol women were not just wives or mothers. They were diplomats, advisors, negotiators. They sat in the courts of the Khans, listening to the whispers of foreign ambassadors, guiding the decisions of their husbands, their sons. They spoke not with swords, but with words, words that carried the weight of nations. In the grand city of Karakoram, where merchants came from every corner of the world, Mongol women managed the affairs of trade, overseeing caravans that stretched across mountains and deserts. They were not just traders, they were negotiators, women who spoke the languages of Persia, of China, of the steppe. In the courts of the great Khan, where scholars and generals debated the fate of empires, Mongol women stood as advisors, their wisdom a shield, their whispers a guide. They were not just silent shadows. They were the heart of the empire, the hidden pillars that held the realm together. When the great Khans rode to war, when the horsemen swept across the world, it was the women who kept the fires burning, who ruled the cities, who held the realm together. They did not wear crowns, but they ruled with a power that could not be seen, but could always be felt. These were the women of the Mongol Empire, the mothers who shaped conquerors, the queens who guided kings, the warriors who rode into battle, the shadows who whispered to empires. They were the hidden pillars of power, women whose strength was not written in the chronicles of war, but in the quiet strength that whispered beneath the winds of the steppe. Chapter 16. The Myths and Mysteries, Legends of the Mongols. Beneath the vast, endless sky of the Mongolian steppe, where the wind swept across the rolling grasslands like a whispered song, the Mongols found their faith. They looked up to the heavens and saw not just an empty blue expanse, but the face of Tengri, the eternal blue sky, the spirit that watched over all life. To the Mongols, Tengri was not just a god. He was the sky itself, vast and infinite, stretching from horizon to horizon. His breath was the wind that swept across the plains, his gaze the sunlight that touched the mountains. He was both distant and close, silent and ever-present. He was the source of life, the voice that whispered through the rustling grass, the power that turned storms into whispers. The Mongols believed that Tengri chose his champions, that he gave his blessing to those who walked with honor and courage. And among all his chosen there was one who stood above the rest, Genghis Khan, the child of the steppe, the man whose destiny was written in the sky. From his youth, Genghis Khan was guided by the will of Tengri. When he was abandoned with his family, left to starve in the wild, it was the strength of the eternal sky that gave him courage. When he rose from a hunted outcast to a leader of men, it was Tengri's favor that cleared his path. In battle, he raised his gaze to the heavens, knowing that the blue sky watched over him. But the blessings of Tengri were not just for warriors. The Mongols believed that all life was connected by the sky, that the earth, the rivers, the forests, and the mountains were part of a sacred whole. They made offerings to Tengri beneath the open sky, pouring out milk or kumis upon the earth, whispering prayers that rose like smoke into the heavens. In times of crisis, they looked to the sky for signs, a hawk soaring upon the wind, a storm that swept across the plains, a rainbow that arched above the mountains. To the Mongols, these were not just natural events. They were the voice of Tengri speaking to those who listened. And as they rode across the world, as their banners fluttered beneath the endless sky, they carried with them the spirit of Tengri, the promise of the blue sky that stretched above them, eternal, boundless, and free. The prophecies of Genghis Khan. Legends of a divine warrior, but the legend of the Mongols was not just written in the sky, it was whispered in the stories of the steppe, stories that spoke of a child born not just of earth and blood, but of destiny. They spoke of Genghis Khan not just as a man, but as a legend, a child of prophecy, a warrior blessed by the spirits of the wild. The tale begins with a wolf and a doe, creatures of the wilderness who roamed the mountains and
valleys of the steppe.
The Mongols believed that from these two sacred animals sprang their people, a race born of strength and grace, of wildness and wisdom. And from this ancient lineage came Genghis Khan. Some said that on the night of his birth, the stars shone, brighter than ever before, their silver light dancing upon the plains. Others whispered that his mother Holin had a vision, a dream of a great warrior who would unite the tribes, who would ride beneath the shadow of the eternal sky, whose name would be whispered in distant lands. And as Genghis Khan grew, the signs of his destiny became clear. He was a boy of iron will, a child who survived the cold hunger of the steppe, who rose from outcast to leader. But even in his darkest moments, the spirits did not abandon him. When he was captured by his enemies, bound and shackled, he escaped, not through strength, but through a whispered promise from the wind, a promise that his destiny was not yet finished. But the greatest legend of all was the sacred sword, a blade said to have been given to him by a shaman, a sword that shone like silver beneath the light of the moon. It was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of his destiny, a blade blessed by the spirits of the steppe, a blade that would carve his name into the bones of history. These stories were more than just tales, they were a reflection of the spirit of the Mongols, a people who believed that their destiny was written not just in the earth, but in the sky. And as Genghis Khan rode forth, as his armies swept across mountains and deserts, it was not just a man who led them, it was a legend, the curse of the Khan's tomb, a secret lost in time. But even legends must one day fade, and even the greatest of warriors must one day rest. When Genghis Khan breathed his last, his followers did not simply bury him, they hid him, sealing his tomb beneath the shadow of mystery. It is said that his body was taken in secret, carried by his most loyal warriors, to a hidden valley. Some say he was buried beneath the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun, his grave marked by nothing but the whisper of the wind. Others speak of a river, diverted from its course to cover his tomb, its waters flowing forever above his resting place. But wherever he was laid, one thing was certain. None were to know of his grave. His loyal guard, a force of 1,000 horsemen, swore an oath of silence. They rode in a great circle around the tomb, slaying any who dared to approach. As the years passed, They vanished, their vow carried with them into the dust of the steppe. Some say that even the trees of the valley were cut down, the earth flattened, the soil turned to hide any trace of the sacred ground. Others tell of a curse that would fall upon any who sought to disturb the sleep of the great Khan. Centuries have passed, and the tomb of Genghis Khan remains lost, a secret whispered by the mountains, a shadow hidden beneath the sky. Many have searched, drawn by the dream of treasure, of glory, of touching the shadow of the greatest conqueror the world has ever known. But they have found only the whisper of the wind, the silence of the steppe. The tomb of Genghis Khan is not just a grave. It is a legend, a mystery that will never be solved, a secret that will never be told. The eternal return, the spirit of the steppes, but even in death, Genghis Khan did not truly vanish. His body may have been lost, his tomb hidden beneath the shadow of the mountains, but his spirit remained, whispering in the winds that swept across the plains, dancing in the shadows of the mountains, burning in the hearts of his people. For the Mongols believed that the spirit of a great warrior did not die. It became part of the eternal sky, a shadow that watched over the world, a whisper that spoke to those who listened. And in the stories of the steppe, in the songs of the bards, who rode beneath the endless sky, his name lived on. Genghis Khan became more than a man. He became a legend. His name was whispered in the courts of kings, in the bustling bazaars of distant cities, in the shadowed halls of ancient temples. He was the conqueror who swept across the world, the child of prophecy, the man who was born beneath the blessing of the eternal sky. But even beyond his legend, the spirit of the Mongols lived on, the spirit of the steppe, the spirit of freedom, the spirit of those who rode beneath the open sky, who followed the wind, who saw the world not as a prison, but as an endless horizon. And even today, as the wind sweeps across the plains, as the grass dances beneath the sunlight, as the mountains rise like silent guardians beneath the blue sky, the whisper of the Mongols can still be heard. For the steppe has no end, the sky has no borders, and the spirit of the Mongols is an eternal whisper, a whisper that will never fade. Chapter 17. Echoes of an Empire. The lasting legacy of the Mongols. Beneath the endless sky of the Mongolian steppe, where the wind whispered through the tall grass and the mountain stood like silent guardians, a great story began, a story that did not end with the death of Genghis Khan. For the shadow of the great Khan did not fade. It stretched across mountains, across deserts, across seas. It stretched across the world. His sons and grandsons were not just the children of a conqueror. They were the heirs of an empire, and they carried his spirit with them, a flame that burned with the dream of the steppe. And from that dream, new empires were born. In the distant lands of India, a young warrior named Babur, a descendant of both Genghis Khan and Timur, rose to power. He was not just a prince, he was the founder of a new dynasty, the Mongol Empire, a realm of marble palaces,
of lush gardens of art and poetry.
Beneath the shadow of the Himalayas, his descendants built cities of gold, their names whispered in the courts of kings, Akbar, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb. In the mountains of Central Asia, the Kazakh Khanate rose, a realm of horsemen who carried the blood of the steppe in their veins, who rode across the wide plains beneath the gaze of the eternal blue sky. Their khans traced their lineage to the great Khan, their banners fluttering like dark wings in the wind. In Persia, the Ilkhanate flourished, a kingdom of scholars and warriors, where the teachings of Islam mingled with the traditions of the Mongols. It was a land of grand mosques, of bustling markets, of scholars who mapped the stars, and in Russia the Golden Horde left a shadow that would linger for centuries. The princes of Moscow, who once paid tribute to the Mongol Khans, rose to power, their city becoming a great capital, their realm an empire that stretched from the frozen north to the warm seas of the south. These were the sons of the steppes, men, who carried the spirit of Genghis Khan, who carved kingdoms and empires from the bones of the world. They were not just conquerors, they were builders, rulers, dreamers, and even as the centuries passed, even as their empires rose and fell, the blood of the great Khan flowed in their veins, a whisper of thunder beneath the open sky. The bridge
of civilizations, a world united by trade. But the legacy of the Mongols was not just written in the blood of battles. It was written in the roads that stretched across mountains and deserts,
in the caravans that wound like rivers through the valleys, in the great cities where merchants haggled beneath bright canopies, where scholars debated beneath the shadow of grand minarets. For the Mongols did not just conquer, they connected. Beneath the shadow of their banners, the ancient Silk Road flourished. From the bustling markets of Samarkand to the golden palaces of Baghdad, from the jade towers of Beijing to the spice-scented harbors of Venice, a world that had once been a tapestry of isolated kingdoms became a single, vast marketplace. Caravans travelled beneath the protection of the Khan's promise, their camels laden with silks and spices, with silver and porcelain. Persian merchants brought the wisdom of the stars to China, while Chinese scholars shared the secrets of paper and gunpowder with the West. Spices from India flavoured the dishes of distant lands, while Venetian glassware glittered beneath the lanterns of the Khan's court. But it was not just goods that travelled these roads, it was ideas. The teachings of Confucius crossed the mountains, mingling with the philosophy of Aristotle, with the wisdom of the Quran. Scholars from Persia, from China, from the Islamic world met in the great cities of the Mongol Empire, sharing their knowledge, debating the mysteries of the stars, the secrets of the human soul. In the grand city of Karakoram, the capital of the Mongol Empire, diplomats from distant kingdoms spoke 100 tongues, their voices mingling like the songs of birds. In the libraries of Baghdad, the words of Greek philosophers were translated into Arabic, their wisdom preserved beneath the golden domes. The Mongols were not just warriors, they were the bridge between worlds, the guardians of a world connected by trade, by knowledge, by the whisper of the wind across the plains. And as their empire stretched across mountains and seas, the world became smaller, a world where the dreams of one land became the treasures of another. The memory of fear, a world that trembled, but even as the Mongols left a legacy of trade and knowledge, they left another legacy, a legacy of fear. For the shadow of the great Khan was not just a light, it was a darkness that swept across the world, a storm that left cities in ruins, that left kingdoms trembling beneath the whisper of his name. From the frozen forests of Russia to the golden deserts of Persia, from the green valleys of China to the bustling markets of Baghdad, the stories of Mongol cruelty spread like wildfire. They spoke of cities burned to the ground, their streets choked with smoke and ash. They spoke of rivers that ran red with the blood of the fallen. They spoke of the pyramids of skulls that marked the path of the Mongol horde. In the cities of Europe, the whisper of the Mongols became a shadow that stretched across the mountains, that danced upon the winds. Merchants spoke of towns that vanished in a single night, their walls shattered, their people swept away. Kings trembled in their halls, their maps marked with the shadow of the horde. But even beyond the stories of war, there was a deeper fear, a tzixt, fear of a world that had become small, a world where the thunder of hooves could sweep across mountains, where a storm could rise from the plains and swallow kingdoms. The Mongols were not just a memory, they were a shadow, a whisper of thunder, a reminder that beneath the beauty of the world lay a darkness that could never be forgotten. The whispering wind. A world that remembers. But even as the centuries passed, even as the empires of the Mongols rose and fell, their spirit did not fade. Beneath the endless sky of the steppe, where the wind whispered through the tall grass, their story remained, a story whispered by the mountains, by the rivers, by the rustling leaves of the forests. The Mongols became more than conquerors. They became a legend. Their name was whispered in the courts of kings, in the bazaars of distant cities, in the shadowed halls of ancient temples. They were the storm that swept across the world, the riders who moved like shadows, the conquerors who left a scar upon the earth. But even beyond their legends, their spirit lived on, the spirit of the steppe, the spirit of the eternal sky, the spirit of those who rode beneath the open sky, who followed the wind, who saw the world not as a prison, but as an endless horizon. Today, beneath the vast sky of Mongolia, the wind still sweeps across the plains, rustling the grass, whispering through the mountains. The yurts of the nomads still stand beneath the shadow of the mountains, their flaps fluttering in the breeze. Riders still race across the plains, their horses galloping beneath the endless blue. And the stories of the Mongols still dance upon the wind, the stories of Genghis Khan, the child of the steppe who became a conqueror, of Kublai Khan, who ruled a realm of jade and gold, of the warrior queens who rode into battle, of the wise mothers who shaped empires. The world has changed. The cities of marble and gold have crumbled. The kingdoms that once trembled have become shadows. But the spirit of the Mongols lives on, not just in the pages of history, but in the whisper of the wind, in the shadow of the mountains, in the endless sky that stretches above. For the world may forget the names of kings, the stones of palaces may crumble, but the wind never forgets. It whispers, it remembers, it carries the story of the Mongols, the story of a world that trembled, of a world that was united, of a world that will never forget the sons of the steppe.